Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay up the back. The mic levels are all good. Yes, fantastic. Very good. Great to see you all today, and also all the folk online. Welcome to the ANU Energy Update for 2025. My name is Llewelyn Hughes, and I'm the director at the moment of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, or ICEDS, here at the ANU. Let me begin by paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land where we're meeting today here in the ACT, and also acknowledge and welcome any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today or who are listening in online. I'll stop for 1 second just because we've got another flow of people coming in. Welcome, welcome. Terrific. So as many of you will have already seen, and is going to be a big focus, particularly of the first part of today's panel, 2025 is a very important year for climate and for energy policy here in Australia, and also, of course, globally. Globally, as the Climate Change Authority's recent independent advice on 2035 targets to government pointed out, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere reached the highest level in recorded history at 422.7 parts per million. It was also the most rapid increase, a one-year increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide relative to the previous year. In addition, in 2024, global measured average temperatures passed a threshold of 1.5 degrees for the first time in recorded history. Now, that is a one-year change. It's not that we have broken that barrier forever, but it's the first time that we have seen that occur in recorded history. And of course, that means that the 1.5 degree target under the Paris Agreement is under threat, although I think we can say we haven't reached that yet. Now, against that, we are seeing substantial increases in climate ambition from governments around the world. 52 countries have submitted nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement to the UNFCCC. And that represents 31% of global emissions. China's about to formally submit its own NDC, and we've seen the announcement already. And that's obviously going to substantially increase the total share of global emissions which are covered by NDCs which have been submitted that incorporate 2035 targets. As I mentioned, exactly 1 week ago, actually from today, the Chinese government announced its national emissions target. And for the first time, they capped emissions in absolute terms. And it's also the case that China's greenhouse gas emissions may peak in 2025. Now, you've probably read quite a bit about that online, different commentary. A lot of people have pointed out that the target that the Chinese government has announced, that is a reduction of 7 to 10% relative to the peak of their emissions, which we might perhaps take as this year, is not enough. Not enough in terms of global warming globally, but also not enough in terms of China's goal of reaching carbon neutrality by 2060. But nevertheless, I think that we should recognize that as really a quite historic moment. As many of you know, China is by far and away the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions globally, representing something like 29% of emissions globally, with the United States coming second at around 11 or so percent. Of course, it looks very different on a per capita basis. But the fact that China has committed to an absolute cap on emissions for the first time, I think is something to celebrate and also recognize as a significant change in terms of the global climate architecture. A second major trading partner of Australia, particularly in energy-intensive bulk commodities, Japan, has also submitted its 2035 NDC. That was actually submitted in February of this year, although we didn't get a lot of news, I think, about that in Australia, despite the importance of that country to our overall trading relationships. They've said that they're going to reduce their emissions by 60% by 2035, although they do use the target, the baseline year of 2013, which is in a way their peak, because of course the Fukushima nuclear disaster meant that they were using a lot of oil, coal, in addition to gas within their electricity system at the time. Nevertheless, it does represent an increase in ambition relative to their prior NDC. So there are signs, I think, that in 2025, that our region is changing around us. Now, of course, what we're focused on, the first part of the panel, is what's happening here in Australia. And 2025 obviously is a very important year for our own climate and energy policy. I want to note, first of all, that a couple of weeks ago, the federal government released the first ever national climate risk assessment, as well as our first national adaptation plan. Now, the climate risk assessment says that future extreme weather is likely to differ significantly from the past, that there are going to be changes in the timing, duration, intensity, and spatial patterns of hazards, with events occurring more frequently in combination with another and also in new locations. And importantly that, and I quote, historical observations on their own are not likely to be an indicator of future risk. So there's actually, quite aside from the discussion we're going to have today, I think a very important piece of work which is ahead of us, which is about making real disaster risk and also adaptation planning in order to plan for this more uncertain climate future that we see in front of us. It's something that we do quite a lot of work here at ICEDS and at the ANU more broadly. We recently released in conjunction with NEMA a set of guidelines for nature-based solutions to flood risk, for example. Those are available on our website and are designed to enable very practical solutions for thinking about managing flooding risk using nature-based solutions, if you can download those. Now, of course, the federal government has also announced its emissions reduction target for 2035. That target is an economy-wide target, and it also covers all greenhouse gas emissions. And that's going to be a strong focus of the first part of today's event. The announcement was preceded by independent advice from the Climate Change Authority, and that's required under law. So I'm particularly delighted to be able to welcome today the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Climate Change Authority, Eliza Murray, to offer her views on the work that they have done, and also to participate after that in our first panel, where we will think about obstacles and opportunities for meeting those newly ambitious 2035 targets. Now, like with China's target, I guess there's been a lot of commentary about Australia's own target of 62 to 70% emissions reduction by 2035. Regardless of where you stand on that, it's absolutely clear that we are going to need new policy settings. Even if we were to introduce an economy-wide tax on carbon, which properly accounted for the social cost of carbon, for example, we would need, nevertheless, a whole range of new policies that solve other kinds of market failure, not just the environmental externality associated with the release of carbon dioxide. We have a large number of coordination failures, where it's challenging to get different levels of government, as well as business actors and communities together to enable transition to new industries, for example. There's also big questions around community benefits and how we enable communities to participate in a newly decarbonising economy, how we should carry that out. It's quite well known now that Australia has an extremely low level of energy-related research and development spending, relative to its GDP when you compare us to the OECD average. There's a lot of shared infrastructure in ports and transmission, which also have to be managed as well. So a very broad range of different policies in the palette that will need to be thought about and designed and implemented if we are to achieve this target. Now, I mentioned a couple of international developments a moment ago around China and Japan. And one thing I did want to draw your attention to in the Climate Change's Independent Authority is part 4 of their advice to government, which focuses on international perspectives and the international context. It was terrific to see that included. Aside from the broad implications of the choices that our trading partners make around climate ambition for the loss and damage that we're going to face, given that this is a global problem, the choices that our major trading partners make affect us through 2 quite distinct pathways. First, as I mentioned a minute ago, the choices these countries make, countries like China, India, Indonesia, Japan, and so on, make around the speed at which they decarbonize, and also the types of technology that they choose to decarbonize, have big implications for the pace at which our continued export of emissions-intensive bulk commodities will fall. It's clear they will reduce, but the speed at which that happens is technology dependent, and it's also dependent on levels of ambition. The second pathway is through which we are affected by changes in the region is around the opportunities, and particularly the opportunities to export low carbon products to our region to help them decarbonize. For example, green iron and steel has become an important focus of discussion in Australia today, moving on from the 2019 hydrogen strategy when we were thinking a lot more about exporting hydrogen as a molecule, right? So the second panel that we have today after the coffee break is going to think about that particular issue, how we can unlock the opportunities, particularly in green iron and steel, through enabling partnerships with our trading and investment partners, and what kind of policy settings we need in order to unlock capital, particularly private capital, because it's certainly not something that government can do alone. So let me stop there and introduce our keynote speaker for today, Eliza Murray from the Climate Change Authority. Many of you have probably had the opportunity to review that advice. If you haven't, I commend it to you. The document's fantastic research practice. In fact, I teach a class here on research methods, and we do a class on mixed methods. And I was delighted to see that the Climate Change Authority had included a whole range of different methods, not just formal modeling, but also a lot of consultation. In fact, over 500, I think, pieces of consultation around the country to take advantage of sociological insights in addition to economic modeling. Eliza joined the Climate Change Authority in 2019, I should say, and she's currently the Deputy CEO, and she oversees the development of that expert advice to government. So if you could join me in welcoming Eliza.
Thank you, Jerry. No worries. While we get that set up, I'd like to start by reinforcing the acknowledgement of traditional custodians of the lands that we're meeting on today, and also acknowledge their knowledge systems and laws and languages and customs and stories that have endured and adapted over millennia. I think that's an important thing for us to reflect on when we're thinking about the changes that have happened over the last 200 or so years since the Industrial Revolution, and the kind of pace of change that we're talking about needing now. The advice that I'm going to be talking about today, it's not just advice on a target. It's advice on Australia's transition from being a net exporter of emissions to being a net exporter of abatement. So at the moment, Australia exports more emissions than we cause to occur here. So from coal and gas that we export and that's combusted overseas, we're talking about around about 1 billion tonnes a year being emitted when they're burnt overseas. And that compares to across the entire Australian economy, every sector, every person, add it all up, that's about 440 million tonnes. So our country, 440 million tonnes in-house. And what happens when we export fossil fuels? Around 1 billion a year. So we have dug up gas and coal for decades. It's kind of a big and important part of our economy, but global demand is projected to decline. So I think for coal, the projection is around 70% by 2050, and for gas and oil, I think it's about 40% by 2050. And that's something we're going to have to adjust to regardless of Australia's domestic emissions if other countries are on track to reduce theirs. That's our supply chain. I think it's time then for us to talk about flipping the script. So going from being an exporter of emissions to being an exporter of abatement. If the next boom is shaping up to be one of decarbonising world and our exports being related to the sun and the wind and critical minerals and green metals, I think that's an important thing for us to start thinking, getting ourselves ready for. And we are starting to see parts of that happen. But the reality is, before we export abatement, we are going to need to prove that it works at home. An ambitious and credible target is what we need to build trust with partners and investors. And it's not just the target itself, it's what's actually happening on the ground or on rooftops. Because every solar panel on a suburban rooftop, every EV on a regional road, every battery pack in a workshop, that's part of the story of turning emissions reductions into value creation. We're creating markets, jobs, and influence. So what I'm talking about today, it's not just a target. It's trade policy, industrial strategy, foreign policy, all rolled into one. So allow me now to open what might seem like a bit of a black box in how the authority reaches its advice on a target. We're going to talk a bit about the how, what we did to get to a number, everyone who was involved in that process, the trade-offs that had to be made, and talk about what we found and where we've landed. All right, I was going to go through all of our members one by one, but rather than go through everyone, there's probably some familiar faces here. So our chair in the middle is Matt Keane, former Treasurer of New South Wales, and before that, Climate and Energy Minister. You can see Virginia Marshall, that some of you might recognise. She's the, I think, inaugural Indigenous postdoc here at ANU. We've got Australia's chief scientist over on the far left. We've got a few other scientists. We've got industry people, former head of National Farmers Federation, former head of Business Council of Australia. We've got business people, investors, a really wide range of areas of expertise and their networks that they consult with and talk to as they're going through a project like this. So I think that scope of expertise is a really important part of the process that we do when we're developing advice, and wanted to put their faces on the slide so you can see that this is actually a very human exercise. Even when we're down to the actual decision point, it's not a calculator. It's people actually having that discussion around what the trade-offs are, what the impacts are for their stakeholders across the nation, and all of the input that we had in the process of developing our advice. So the CCA, though, is more than just its members. We've got 9 fabulous members that are the ultimate decision makers, but we also have a secretariat. We've got our CEO, Brad Archer, in the room today. We've got quite a lot of other of our staff tuning in and watching. So shout out to them for all the excellent work that they've done in putting this project together. It's about 65 people, analysts, researchers, communicators, scientists, engineers, lawyers. It's a broad suite of expertise in that group as well. And what we've done is let's say it's the grunt work. We brief the members so that they've got all the evidence they need to feed into their deliberations and their decision on what the target should be. And this is the mixed methods approach that Llewelyn mentioned before. There's 5 parts here, and then if you want to count a 6th, why not? That's where it goes to our members to bring all of these threads together. So the first is it being grounded in science, and we started with the scientific analysis of what is the global emissions budget, how is that going to be allocated to different countries, what needs to be done to keep emissions within acceptable ranges given the targets of the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement calls on us, and in fact we've signed up, as have, I think it's 196 other parties, to hold our emissions within 2 degrees and strive to keep them within 1.5. And that was an important part feeding into our research. The other things in the Paris Agreement are highest possible ambition within the context of your common but differentiated responsibilities, respective capabilities and national circumstances. And then you ratchet up. So there's no backsliding in targets. Once you've set one, they only go in one direction. And the idea behind that framing of the agreement was that the different parties would build trust in each other, and they would see that that other parties are doing their share and move up together. So the ratchet mechanism is a really important part of the Paris Agreement. And no backsliding, I think, is a really interesting one, because reflecting on that and putting myself in the mindset of a minister or a prime minister who's being asked to sign on to a target, if you're not confident you can meet it, then really that international agreement, so submitting an NDC, a nationally determined contribution with a target in it, if something changes, you can't backslide. You can't weaken that target. You're tied to it, you're committed to it, but you can push in the opposite direction. And as we looked at the uncertainty in the things that need to happen for us to achieve a target, we did factor that into the consideration in putting forward a range for the target, so 62 to 70%. 70% is technically achievable, but it requires everything to go right. 62% we can be more confident of, and there's room to move up from there. All right, systems-wide modelling. So we commissioned the CSIRO to do the economic modelling, and that was to make sure we understood what the costs were and what the interactions were between different emissions reductions across the economy and related on different paths that the globe may take. So there were a series of scenarios that they modelled based on the world reaching 1.5, the world reaching 2, Australia reaching net zero by 2050, 2045, 2040, 2035. And that was all the different scenarios that we looked at, how that played out, what the costs look like as we were formulating our advice. Sectoral deep dives was basically ground truthing what we got out of the modelling. So we went and did ground up analysis, speaking to businesses and stakeholders, looking at what barriers they were facing. And this is the kind of thing that modelling doesn't see. So things like a supply chain constraint. I need this bit of kit, but I can't get it in this country right now. Or I actually need electric vehicle mechanics or electricians. There's just none here. We need to skill them up, and just not having enough people. So the workforce shortages and things like that. So as we did that ground up analysis, it was part of our sector pathways review. So we published that a few months ago now, last year. Was it last year? Gosh, this year has flown. But that's a bit of a deep dive into the sector by sector, what we took account of, and also the policies that you could put in place to overcome those barriers. So stakeholder engagement. So we put out 3 issues papers for this one. One of those was the infamous one where we said 65 to 75 degrees. Put your hand up if you made a submission to one of those processes, or if you're a member of an organisation that did. Hot tip, ICEDS was one of them. All right, well, thank you to everyone who did participate, because that kind of input is a really important contribution to our analysis and the evidence base that we have when we're coming up with a target. We got over 500 submissions to those processes. We had an awful lot of conversations. I think it was about 550 that we had on record, but that doesn't count the ones in the tea rooms and just the sideline chats when we were at conferences, and the kind of intel that we were collecting that way through the formal and informal processes, and that our members were as well when they were out talking to their networks, has just been invaluable part of the process. in putting our advice together. Now, the last one I've got here is geoeconomic analysis. And Llewelyn through to this a little bit earlier. It's looking at what targets countries are putting in place, but also what policies they're putting in place and what's actually happening on the ground in those countries, like what is happening with our exports and the things that we want to import. How are they affected by the decisions made elsewhere? Now, the part of this analysis that perhaps got most attention was the Trump election. So with the change of administration in the US, we did a bit of a dive into what that could mean for Australia. So the US reducing investment under the Inflation Reduction Act, which was US investment in a lot of transition technologies and deployment. What did that mean for us? Did it mean the technologies would get to us later? Or did it mean that the investment wasn't going to be finding a home in the US and it was going to be looking for a new one? And we're a pretty good one. So we weighed up all of those different effects, and it also wasn't just from US to Australia. There's a few things in a broader trade network of how some of our suppliers would be affected by the US that would then flow through to us. So looking, I guess, more broadly at how the impacts in one part of the world can reverberate along supply chains and affect our decarbonisation options was a really important part of this analysis. All right, now coming back to science. This chart might look a bit familiar, but it might also look a bit different. And the difference with this one is that the base year is, or the average that we're marking against here with the blue and the red lines, is from 1971 to 2000. So where you're seeing the red part above the line, that's in a lot of our lifetime, a lot of our living memory, that we've seen that level of climate change above what is sort of normal, above a longer term average. So these are the diversions from the normal. And the blue below there, even looking at that, you can see how the line's gone up. Another important thing with this is looking at the emissions trajectory and looking at the rise in climate. If we stop putting out more emissions, the climate keeps rising. So it's not just that you turn off the tap to emissions, even if such a thing were possible, that you've solved the problem. Actually, a lot of the warming is baked in. So we didn't focus on it an awful lot in this report, but the National Climate Risk Assessment and Adaptation Plan are looking into it in more detail. We do need to have our mind to adaptation as well as reducing emissions. And it is everything, everywhere, all at once on both sides of that. Last year as well was the first year, and Llewelyn mentioned this as well, to go over 1.5 degrees. And I just wanted to mention that briefly because some people say, well, Paris Agreement's done then, we failed. Let's move on to something else. Just adaptation perhaps, don't worry about reducing emissions. My answer to that is just no. Every tiny little skerrick of a degree matters. Every percentage point on a target matters. Every tonne matters. If we go over 1.5, the goal is to go over as little as possible and ideally come back. And I also feel compelled to explain that going over it in 1 year doesn't mean you've actually reached what the Paris Agreement is aiming for. Because climate's quite volatile and moves around a bit, it'll be quite a few years before it's declared as having been breached. And it'd need to be, I think it's a 20-year average going over 1.5 before it's technically over. But my gosh, it is a terrifying state of affairs that we're already seeing it in 1 year. And there's no sign of that coming down yet. All right, now to the target. So 62 to 70%. What we were looking for in developing this target was ambitious, achievable, and in our national interest. They partly sort of broadly align with the requirements of the Climate Change Authority in developing its advice. So that's got to be economically efficient. It's got to be aligned with Australia's international trade policy. It's got to be economically efficient. It's got to be environmentally effective. It's got to be equitable. There's a whole lot of other principles that we need to take account of when developing our advice. But in a nutshell, ambitious, achievable, and in our national interest. Now, you've probably heard, you might have thought it yourself, that this doesn't look ambitious enough. It's not 100%, it's not that close to it. So how is this ambitious? So I want to go through a few slides that explain how we arrived at finding that this target is as ambitious as possible. Who knows what their carbon footprint is? Yeah, do you want to tell me? How much? 4. Go you. That's the sign of someone who probably lives in the ACT where all of our electricity is renewables, probably doesn't eat meat, drives an EV or takes public transport or bikes. That's really low, really low. So the national average is 16.5 kilograms of carbon a year. That's one of the highest in the world. Would you commit to bringing that down by 62 to 70% in the next decade? Just pretend you're an average human, average Australian. Maybe, still sounds like a lot for me. But the reality is that's not actually enough, because we've got a carbon budget that we've got to allocate across the population, and we've got a growing population. So once you factor in the projected population growth, the reduction that we're asking for per person from that 16.5 average is 76 to 81%. And that means coming from over 16 to 7.5 kilograms at the lower end, or if you're more of a 70% person, we're looking at under 6 kilos. So you've got 10 years to bring it down by 10 kilos a year. So going on a decarb diet, bringing that down 1 kilo a year, every year over the next decade. That's pretty ambitious. I'm going to take it now back to megatons, going a bit macro again here. So this is back to the nation, every sector, every human in the country all added up. And we're talking millions of tonnes here, megatons. And what the speedometer shows is the pace of emissions reductions that we need. So over the past 5 years, we've averaged 8 megatons reduction a year. 2025, we've got 11. That's a bit of a boost on the last 5, a bit faster. To meet the 2030 target though, from now till 2030, we need to be averaging 17. And from now till 2035, we need to be averaging 20 to 25 to meet the target that we've recommended. But this isn't the kind of dial where you move the black line over and eventually you catch up to the 20 to 25. No, this is the average. So that is going to move these green parts, the targets parts. Every year that we're not at those numbers, they move around towards the 3 p.m. They're getting further away until we catch up to them, because that average has got to be made up in future years. So we're going to be needing to go faster and faster. What it's really saying is that the sooner we do more, the smoother the decarbonisation pathway is going to be. So go hard, go fast, go now. I'm going to skip over this because it's largely showing the same thing. And this is showing some of the ways to get there, but I'll come back to that sector by sector at Llewelyn's request. So here we go. This waterfall chart is showing the sector by sector share of meeting the 62 to 70% target that we've recommended. And what this is showing is that electricity and energy are going to be called on to make about 50% of that emissions reduction. And the next biggest contribution comes from resources. We've already got the policies in place in a lot of these sectors. It's not to say they're doing enough. They all need to be refined and bolstered, and there are some gaps that we're going to need to patch. But when you think about electricity and energy, we've got the CIS, the Capacity Investment Scheme, as one of the big ones. In transport, we've got the new Vehicle Efficiency Standard, the INVEST. Industry, we've got the Safeguard Mechanism. Agriculture, we've got the ACCU scheme. Resources again, Safeguard. Built environment, we've got GEMS, so the Greenhouse and Energy Minimum Standards, MEPS, Minimum Energy Performance Standards, and the one that I am forgetting the name of, what is it? NABERS, thank you. Yeah. So these are the efficiency standards and the measures to improve the emissions reduction in the built environment. Thank you, Alison. All right, so moving on, I'm going to skip a few here, might come back to. So the sector by sector breakdown. So going to electricity, and this is the one that's making 50% of the contribution, but it's even more important than that 50% because it's only when we've got renewable electricity that electrifying everything else makes sense. Because if you're electrifying it and you're still using fossils, then you're not really decarbonising. So it's really important that electricity goes first and foremost. What our analysis looked at is AEMO's integrated system plan step change scenario. And that, if you map it through, comes to 93% emissions reduction, 93% renewables target, which the government hasn't committed to, and nor have we asked them to, because it's transferable. So if those emissions reductions aren't met here, they can be met elsewhere in the economy. So there's a bit of flexibility here to move around what's met and where. Some of the other things that are happening in this sector, in the scenarios that we modelled, we're looking at 6 times the growth in utility storage. So this is your big batteries, 4 times quadrupling of wind capacity, 3 times utility solar capacity, and doubling rooftop solar capacity. So these are each ambitious and big contributions. All right, I'm on the 4-minute mark, so I'm speeding up here. Transport, you might have seen that we're talking about half of small vehicles sold from now till 2035 being electric. That is a big one. Also low carbon fuels for heavy vehicles and air travel. Industry and waste. So we are looking at electrification of the low heat processing, and for the high heat processing, more biofuels and potentially a bit of hydrogen in the mix as well. And waste, compost. Agriculture, we are looking at a little bit of seaweed. You might have heard of Asparagopsis being fed to cows to stop them burping and farting so much methane. That's one small part of it, but there's also better use of better fertilisers in the mix there as well. Now, resources, I mentioned, was one of the bigger contributors, and a lot of that comes from fossil methane, so fugitive emissions. And one of the things that is sort of next off the mark of a technology to start reducing that is VAM, so ventilated air methane. And that's one that's starting to reach price parity, and we just need a bit of a boost to get that adopted under Safeguard as well. CCA will be doing more advice on that in the not too distant, I predict. Built environment, we did speak about a little bit, but essentially it comes down to electrification and energy efficiency. They're 2 of the biggest parts. And when the government was announcing our target, it also announced 85 billion for household and business renewable, energy efficiency that'll help contribute to that. And on the land, one of the firmer recommendations that did get a bit of attention was to stop native logging and to reduce native harvest, and that was drastically reduce native harvest. Engineered removals, I won't stick on, but just to note that that's a very wide band of uncertainty, and we're looking at a very low margin on that, that y-axis. So chapter 4 that Llewelyn mentioned earlier is about offshore contributions. This is about reducing fossil fuel exports, increasing green exports, and the other contributions Australia can make to help reduce emissions in other countries, whether that's through green finance or technical support or capacity building. There's a range of different measures that it could adopt. And a slide here on the economics, because one question that we often get is, how much is it going to cost? So what the CSIRO modelling found is that we can look at continuing growth of 2.7% under the scenario that we recommended. We're looking at a lot of the costs being unavoidable anyway. So this is about replacing coal generators that are reaching end of life. That cost is coming regardless of the target. We're looking at AEMC's finding, which is that household energy costs could be $1,000 less with a coordinated renewables rollout. And then back to where I started. The benefits of an orderly transition that includes the green export dimension could be 5 to 8 times larger than the costs. So let me go, final slide. If we want to move from exporting emissions to exporting abatement, we need to build things up. We can't just shut things down. And that means new jobs and incomes for the regions that are dependent on coal and gas. It means building up new industries as we phase out the industries of the past. And we're already seeing sparks of that. We're seeing more houses with solar panels now than have swimming pools. We're seeing 1,000 houses a day getting a battery. And we're seeing critical minerals being refined here. These aren't small things. They're the scaffolding of a new economy. Australia is more than just a quarry. We can be the world's clean energy workshop. We can be the exporter of solutions. Thank you.
Super, thanks so much, Eliza. It's striking the calculation that you gave us around, I mean, obviously it's a society-wide emissions reduction target, if we like, and that's one of the things that was emphasised in the report, that everyone has to pull their weight, individuals, of course, but also industry, government, at different levels of government as well. But, you know, accepting that, nevertheless, the calculation that you offered around the required emissions reduction per capita, given population growth, you know, which often we may not think about intuitively, you know, in 2035 is quite striking calculation to have made. So we've got quite a lot of time now. We've allocated a lot of time for discussion and also for Q&A, including questions from the audience online and also from all of you through until about 3:40, when we're going to break for coffee and then come back for the second panel. So let me just briefly introduce the panel now, which is going to dive deeper into the discussion that we've just heard from Eliza. The panel is chaired by Alison Reeve, and Alison's the Director for Energy and Climate Change Program at the Grattan Institute, and really one of the leading thinkers and communicators, I think, around helping us understand Australia's climate and energy policies. Alison's going to be joined by Associate Professor Marnie Shaw, who is the Deputy Director at the School of Engineering here at the ANU. And Marnie's work, it combines both engineering but also social science and social science research in thinking about how to build a resilient, decarbonised and distributed energy system, which is an important part, I think, of the discussion. Third, let me note there's been one change in the programme. Beck Colvin from here at the ANU was going to be with us today, but she let us know that she's not feeling well. There are a few things going around in Canberra at the moment. And so we had a quick discussion and coordination, and I have to say that I'm absolutely delighted that Andrew Bray has been able to move some things around in his schedule and join us today to talk about community and the importance of involving community in enabling the energy transition. Andrew is the National Director of the Renewable Energy Alliance, or ReAlliance, and he's been in that role since 2013. You know, there's been a name change, previously the Australian Wind Alliance, and it's really an organisation which is a leading voice in thinking about how to help regional communities prosper through the low carbon energy transition. So Andrew, thank you so much for moving your schedule around and joining us today. Really appreciate that. And with that, I'll pass things over to you, Alison. Thanks so much.
Now, I was going to start with some, you know, stats and projects on that target and sectors, and then actually, ever since Eliza put that stat up about your average Australian needs to cut their personal carbon footprint by 75%, I think my head's been going, like me going for overseas holidays. But it is actually a good intro to what we wanted to talk about today, because when we were discussing on how we can tackle this topic, it's got very large. And we thought what we might bring it back to is that personal experience of what it's actually going to be like for Australians. And so, you know, what we sort of wanted to talk a little bit about today is how is the lived experience going to play out for people? Where are there going to be opportunities?
but also where are we going to start to see barriers to people not just changing their lives, but accepting change in their lives as well. And luckily we've got 3 people who know a lot about both the benefits and the barriers. So just on that, I guess, and I don't really mind who wants to start, but I was just thinking, if you'd like to jump in on what do you think some of the big changes are that we're going to see in our lives over the next decade? Maybe Marnie would be a good one, yeah.
Yeah, so I think at the household level, so a couple of kind of obvious that Eliza mentioned will be generating more of the solar on our rooftops. So we're already the highest per capita in the world in terms of generation of solar from the rooftops. We'll also be using more electricity as we electrify our homes and turn off gas and switch our cars to electric. One that's a bit less kind of obvious is around the management of that home electricity. And I think it's worthwhile thinking about the opportunity we have in the fact that a lot of the resources that we're going to electrify, so by that mainly cars that use up a lot of our electricity and heating, hot water and so on, they're quite flexible in when they can be charged or use electricity. So we have an opportunity to think about how to kind of fit that in to the grid that we already have. So we have this great grid that we've all paid for with our electricity bills, like half of our bills pay for the electricity grid that we've built. And we're only using about half of that electricity network that we've built. So I think it's really important, and we're working on this, thinking about how to shift that new electricity demand, and a lot of it will be with the electric vehicles, into that grid capacity that we already have. And that'll be, that will result in the lowest cost system moving forward, so that big chunk of our electricity bills will hopefully get smaller. In practice, day to day, you know, for a lot of people, we won't really notice much. It would just be a very light touch. So the companies that run our electricity networks will very, very occasionally tap into our solar and turn it down, but that'll be just 10 days a year on when we're really churning out the solar. So it'd be like spring days when we have a lot of solar, not much demand. The networks will now, from now on, have the ability to turn down that solar. But that'll be very, very few days. And in exchange, on the other days, we'll be able to export a lot more solar. So having a little bit more control over that massive, fantastic resource that's our rooftop solar. For others of us that have kind of an appetite for, you know, less of a light touch and more of a relationship with our resources, we can actually use the flexibility of our resources to earn money to get bill credits off our electricity bill. So this is, you might have heard about these virtual power plants and so on, where you can think about being more flexible with the way you use electricity and being paid for that in return, because that's now going to be part of our whole grid infrastructure.
So it's kind of a different relationship, isn't it, with our retailers, but also with the system compared to what we've had in the past.
Yeah, that's right. So there's, I'm sure we'll go into the trust element a bit further on, but it is a different relationship, and I think it's a bit of a step. It's a bit of a change for the future.
Yeah. Andy, just on that theme of a bit of a step, there's some, I mean, I guess another step for some communities as well is that they're going to find themselves hosting a whole lot of infrastructure that wasn't there before. Is that, I mean, do you think that's a, I don't know, it is a big change, right? And is that something you speak to people about in your work? Yeah.
Yes, that is pretty much all we speak about in our work. As Llewelyn introduced us before, our work is really, it's really around working with regional communities, given their critical role in what the transition will mean for Australians. So Eliza rattled off those figures before: 6 times the increase in battery energy storage, 4 times the increase in wind energy, 2 times the increase in utility storage. I think I'm getting these right, but subject to correction. And then rooftop solar as well. So I guess one thing just to, sort of in passing, one of the things, because we're talking to regional communities so often, one of the things I like to remind anyone I'm talking to of is that we're all sort of Australians going through the same transition. So all those things that Marnie was sort of outlining around what it's like for energy consumers, all of those ones are the same for regional people as well. But they'll look a little bit different in that the charging, distance, was it distance anxiety or whatever the
Range anxiety.
thank you,
Yeah.
that's the one, will be a little more intense because if you're in the middle of nowhere and you run out of battery, that's a bigger deal than if you're halfway between here and Tuggeranong. So in that sense, some of the things will be the same, but some of the things will be quite different. And the key difference is that regional people live in the regions because they love the place they live in. And so much of what they love about the place is the natural profile, the views, the paddocks, the hilltops, and those kind of things. So for that to change, it's quite a big ask being made of regional Australians. And I guess is in addition to that other aspect which Lou mentioned a little earlier around those, and it was in yours as well, Eliza, those fossil fuel dependent regions that need to come up with new employment options and that kind of thing. So
because there is some of the attraction for some people in regional communities, isn't there, about sort of diversifying the economic base of the region and having diverse sources of income and smoothing out, the sort of drought versus not drought cycle and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and that's part risk, but it's part opportunity as well.
Yeah,
so we'll get into that.
Yeah. And I think the stuff on the fossil fuel communities is interesting as well, because you do get some. There are some regions, I think, where you've got this really, really intense effect. It's like somewhere like ICEDS in North Queensland, for example, or the Hunter Valley or the Latrobe Valley, where you've been focused around coal mining for a very long time. You look at somewhere like ICEDS, around 60% of the jobs in that area are associated with mining, and that's pretty much all coal mining. And when people overseas stop buying, a lot of that coal goes for export. But if we do what Eliza was saying and become, a net exporter of abatement rather than emissions, a lot of those jobs go. And there's not a lot of other industries in that area to take up those people. And I think there's also the other thing I like to think about too is that there's another class of sort of fossil fuel jobs which are not geographically located, but they're spread all through all our communities. If you've taken your car to a mechanic in the last year, you've interacted with someone who most likely at the moment has a job that is focused around something that relies on fossil fuels. Every community has a gas fitter, every community has a mechanic. And those jobs are also going to change a lot. And one of the things we know about electric vehicles is they have far fewer mechanical problems than do petrol cars, which means also there will probably be an overall reduction in the number of mechanics that we need, even if those people are shifting into those new jobs. Eliza, I think when you guys did when you kicked off the process of the target, you guys talked a lot about the net zero mindset as well. Do you want to maybe bring that back to what that's going to mean for, I don't know, choose regional communities, households, whatever you like?
Yeah, great question. I think of the net zero mindset at different levels. So I think for a government, it's thinking about what does a future nation that's reaching net zero look like? What is the shape of the economy? And starting to plan forward for that. And that's what the government's trying to do with the net zero plan and sector plans that come together to get there. But it doesn't stop there. So it affects businesses. So they've now got the mandatory climate risk reporting for our bigger businesses. A lot of them are safeguard entities, but starting to have that mindset, not just, what's my compliance requirement this year? What is it going to look like if this is a net zero world? Like, let's start thinking ahead of what that's going to look like. And I guess then the next level is just thinking about it at household level or small business level, where if you know that that's where we're going for, and it's at 2050, which is in a lot of our lifetimes, how do we think about preparing for that. Like, what do we start doing now so that we're ready for it when we get there, which, you know, the national target is 2050, but the call is to go earlier if we can. So starting to think now about how soon can we and what does it look like when we do?
Yeah, for sure. So none of this is going to be easy, right? I mean, there's a huge amount of change that has to take place in a relatively short period of time as well. Like 10 years is actually not very long. So I guess I mean, we can't foresee everything that's going to possibly go wrong, just as we can't foresee everything that'll go right either. But I thought it might be interesting just to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that we can see now, particularly because the more that we can see them now, the better chance we have of managing the risk. And I mean, I think you know, we could probably do barriers all day if we wanted, but I would like to sort of come to solutions at some point. But from any of your perspective, what are the sort of big things that you're seeing now that are going to be really important over the next 10 years, say?
Should I start?
Go.
Well, just because we already mentioned the one around the trust. So this new relationship with energy companies, we're starting from a point that's not good, where we mostly hate energy companies. So Energy Consumers Australia does a lot of surveys and find that something like 3 in 10 Aussies think that the energy industry is acting in our interests. So now we have to turn around and say, you know, well, can you please trust that company to tap into your solar inverter and turn it down? Promise we'll only do it 10 times a year. That's a bit of a tough ask, I think. So yeah, I mean, it just means that we have to think really carefully and really respect the fact, you know, about how people feel, and it's based on experience that we feel like we've been ripped off for a long time by these companies. So we have to rebuild that trust and be very, very clear when we talking about, say, using the grid more effectively and getting value from our resources, being very transparent about how that money, that profit is shared. You know, we're getting this much, you're getting this much, and you know, I guess basically having a lot of wins and hopefully not too many, you know, terrible things happening in the media that just cause it to be even worse. But I think we've got a bit of an uphill battle in that regard.
Is that the same with some of the people you talk to, Andy?
Oh, it's funny. I guess I'm kind of describing a bit of the same phenomenon, but in a different context, and that is that I think again, when you consider like the prime importance of building all that renewable energy, because that's the foundation of sectoral decarbonisation across all the other sectors, that at the moment the places where we're building them, the communities are not engaged in a way that's allowing them to feel that they trust in the process. So like at the moment, if you think of what the energy transition will look like from the point of view of, say, just a town of 800 people in, I don't know, let's say the central west of New South Wales, and for them, they've got like a renewable energy zone coming towards them. They've heard the word renewable energy zone. A number of people in this room know exactly what that means and what all the component parts of are of it. But in that area, that they'd say, well, what is this thing? I just know of that project down the road there, and I know I've heard of, you know, 100 different projects in this area. Are they all going to get built? Am I going to be ringed with wind turbines? When, you know, people who understand it know that a fraction of those projects are actually going to get built. A whole lot of them are just going to fall by the wayside, and, you know, you won't even know they existed. But there will be a whole lot of consultation around it. The consultation is for this project, and now we're going to consult on this project. Now we're going to be talking about a transmission line, and we're going to consult on that one as well. And people are saying, man, I'm just trying to run a farm, or I'm just trying to run, you know, the local chemist or whatever it is. And it's not in any way user friendly for those people. And so the barrier here, I think, is really one of engagement. Is the way we're engaging around the transition is kind of assuming it's just, you can just do it the way we always did it for this project and this project. But it's a much bigger deal for communities than what I think, to be frank, governments have got their heads around yet. There's got to be a new way of engaging that actually talks to people about what they want for their place rather than what we want for that project or for that transmission line.
I think related point, so a lot of that consultation is in the project development and approval process.
Yeah.
So sometimes you go through all of that and then you go and do it again at state level, then you come back and do it again at federal. There's not a lot of coordination between jurisdictions. It's even worse again if your project happens to be, or your property happens to be on a border of multiple states.
Mhm.
It's just, it is a really, I don't know, fragmented system, I guess, of getting the approvals done. So they're very slow. Also on the consultation approaches. So there are a few different frameworks. Different states have developed their own. Some think that they're the best. It's not one agreed one. I think
Of competition.
it isn't, well, as long as the competition's pushing in the right direction. Yeah, exactly. So if they're competing to have the best practice, then that's great. That's a good outcome. There's probably a bit of room for more coordination and faster approvals. So rather than having separate approval processes for the same project in different jurisdictions, I think there's still room to improve that coordination. Yeah, and then the benefit and burden sharing is the real frameworks that are different between jurisdictions of how the benefits of a project are shared with the people who are affected by them. As from a landholder's perspective, you know, they're talking about having trucks driving across their paddocks, which means they can't plant them out or they can't be producing on them for a while. And it's for the public good, it's not for them. So it's that sharing of the benefit to the landholders is a really important part of overcoming that particular challenge. I think another one of the barriers that we've identified is, we call it the green premium, or the barrier is actually the willingness to pay the green premium, because the low emissions version of things is often more expensive than the incumbent, the old more emissions intensive version. So electric vehicles are one example, but they're starting to reach parity. So once you factor in the running cost of an electric vehicle, they're starting to get close to the cost of a new internal combustion engine vehicle. So that's starting to address that green premium. But I think that's one of the barriers for a lot of these technologies. How do you overcome that green premium? How do you get it to price parity, or how do you build willingness to pay that premium? And that's often a regulatory approach, and things like Safeguard do start to go there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a, can you make the new way cheaper, but also make the old way more expensive at the same time? Like, I think that gives you a bit of speed.
Yeah.
But there is kind of a tension here as well, isn't there, between needing to actually move quite fast, but actually needing to bring everybody along with you and make everyone feel comfortable with the speed at which their life's changing. Yeah. Marnie, if you don't mind, I was just wanted to ask you about something I know you did quite a while ago, but that was that piece of work that you did on algorithms. And because I mean, a lot of this sort of, I think particularly around the grid management stuff and so on, digitization is like actually going to be a big boost to making this light touch. But I think you've done some quite interesting work, haven't you, on designing algorithms and how you get different outcomes if they're designed to benefit different people.
Yeah,
It sort of goes to some of that trust.
was a while ago, but the way I remember.
I loved it, that's why. Yeah.
So in our work, we're writing algorithms for trying to work out the optimal way to operate energy switch, for example. And we work in our team, we've got engineers and technical people, but also social scientists, and that's pretty important. So had written an algorithm to operate a battery to make as much money as possible. And then working with my social scientist colleague, Heather Anson Cooper, she was like, well, don't forget that lots of people don't care that much about how much money the battery's making. They actually really want to know how the battery's working, like what it's doing, you know, how much charge is in the battery, is it going to be reliable if there's a bushfire? And so she was really, I guess, yeah, trying to get through to my thick skull that people care a lot more about. I mean, some people that the money is the most important thing for lots of people, but there are other things that people care about. The transparency is a big one when it comes to digitization and understanding the way our stuff is working and what it's doing. So we did some thinking about how we can write an algorithm that can embed different people's values. So if you care more about it being transparent, you don't mind losing a bit of money, then you might use this algorithm. If you really, really, really care about decarbonisation, the person who's a 4 kilo a year person might choose this option, then you might choose to lose a little bit of money to really maximise the amount of decarbonisation impact you're having. Yeah, so that was.
Yeah. And then a lot of this sort of comes back to as well that we often, I mean, I see this a lot because I hang around with a lot of economists, right? We tend to approach this with a very economic frame about what people value and just assume that that's all about the cost versus the benefits. But we all actually bring this really complex frame to all of this stuff about what we value, and what we value is not necessarily things that you can put a price on, right?
So when we're talking about how do we shift our electricity use within that network capacity that we have, which is our cheapest option moving forward, at the moment the energy industry is kind of going about this in a very economic way. So we're going to give you a tariff, and you're going to care a lot about the tariff and respond to the tariff. But like, how many people know which tariff they're actually on at home? It's a really.
And that's in a room of energy nerds as well, by the way. So just think about what it would be with a more normal crowd.
Don't really know what tariff they're on. But what we know works, what we Australians are really good at is just knowing when the sun is shining. This is what we've had to live with for all of our lives. So that's when we hang out the washing, that's when we put sunscreen on. So it'll be the same with our devices. We see the sun shining, plug in the electric car, shift the hot water heating to when the sun is shining. So just these sort of cues that we're actually good at, and Aussies are really good at, will work much better than trying to get us to behave like robots according to the economic signals.
I really like that.
Yeah, I had one of those kind of wake up moments just about a week ago, because we were talking about the frameworks for benefit and burden sharing, and we were very focused on the dollars, how you can pay your way through anything. We're talking to First Nations communities and people that work with them, and this was about renewable infrastructure, but also carbon farming projects. And they said, no, we don't want your money. We want you to teach our kids how to do carbon accounting and get them jobs, like train them up, talk about career pathways, and give us a way, like an economic opportunity for the future, not just dollars for now. There's no paying your way through in that way. The kind of benefits that they were looking for were kind of more transforming their economy and their kids' lives and things like that in ways that just handing over cash would not have done.
Yeah, so I guess it's about going out to those communities and listening to what they care about. Same with householders. Householders care about all different things. We have to kind of design a system for them, for us. It's our system, it needs to be designed for us.
We did some message, message sort of research, I guess, in regional areas last year. And one of the things we discovered is that targets, particularly national targets, just don't resonate at all.
Yeah.
So I can
Sorry,
there is
Eliza.
so the net zero mindset doesn't make it out of the CBD, basically.
No,
Yeah.
Even consulting on this project, when we're talking about the national target, we had so many people say, I can't meet that, my business can't meet that, my sector can't meet that. And just having to explain, actually, this is a national target, it's everyone. We're having the wrong conversation.
Yeah, that's right. People are up for the conversation around those opportunities and what those things might be. Carbon accounting for your kids.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. But talk about that all day. But you want us to meet what? 82% of what?
So do you feel like the language needs to shift? So I think people don't understand or don't care about words like decarbonisation, net zero, but to something like stop, turn off your gas in your house and power your car with electricity, sort of shift the language to what it actually is that we need to do, not use words like decarbonisation.
Yep, 100%. Make it about actual things. I think is really good. I mean, look, there are some sort of tricks of language that you sort of pick up working with a different audience, and so the transition is a word that we tend not to use in our public comms. People feel, particularly in the fossil fuel regions, that transition means I lose my job. So I'm being transitioned out of the workforce.
So
But
what would you say instead?
well, the shift to clean energy, what we talk about. We're having more clean energy, we're having less coal. Depends on the context, but you find different ways to do it. But also, I mean, the other thing is that it's a lot of the places that we're working in just have a very different view of the world. And it becomes more difficult with the sort of, you know, social media context and more sort of oppositional approach to things. And that sort of, you know, people sort of smell, are you from the other side? Are you talking to us about the stuff you care about that we hate? Is that, you know, so you've got to sort of work your way around that. And that just gives you it's an extra level of complexity in how you talk about it.
I think I do see that sometimes with people when they talk about net zero as something that's being done to them. And I guess this sort of goes to the mindset thing. It's like, no, net zero is not something that's done to you. It's something that you're part of. It's a national project. It's something that's done by people, and it's done, like you were saying, Marnie, it's done for us as well. It's about the systems that were built for us as well. I find this a little annoying with some of the comms coming out of Parliament, as well as ministers who talk about we're doing this and we're doing that, and what I hear is you're doing something to me, right? I actually want to know. I don't want to know what we, the government, are doing. I want to know how's my life going to change, and yeah,
It's us doing it. Like we're
that's the
foot on
thing,
the
right?
side, and
Yeah.
we're installing 1,000 batteries a day. It's
Mm.
us
yeah,
buying the electric.
net zero heroes, right? There we go. Yeah. No, and I mean, like, similarly, a report we wrote a couple of years ago about moving households away from using gas, we very consciously chose to speak about it as upgrading, not electrifying, to reflect that often the experience of using, you know, you actually get a better appliance. Like induction cooktops are just better and heat pumps are just better. So it's yeah.
And they're the things that people come across every day. Like if you're using a stove which is a bit substandard, doesn't turn on properly, upgrading it is like something you want to be doing.
Yeah.
But
and
I think it's a danger. Like when you look the climate science in the eyeballs and you realise what the issues are and how desperately important it is, you want to say to people, upgrading that cooktop is really important because of climate change, but actually a whole lot of other people don't really care that much about the climate imperative of it, but they care about other parts of their lives, and so you have to be talking about the importance of that.
Yeah, for sure. Are there other things you think that sort of fall into that same theme of where, you know, we've got this opportunity to maximise our chances of succeeding, or, you know, there are some sort of risk management strategies that we could kind of do at this stage?
I think talking to our trade partners and looking at supply chains is a big one. So this is the upstream on our supply chain and making sure we can still buy the things that we need, or at least get the services and the types of products that we need, and downstream of where we're selling things to. If they're going to stop buying what we're selling, can we meet their needs in other ways? So it might be a transition. I use the word. But I am going from and to a transmission.
I still find myself using it.
Yeah.
So going from emissions intensive fuel products to the low emissions version of it. So steel is one example, but the latest talk about that is more that we'll be exporting iron, so moving up the value chain, but not producing the final product, and talking to our trade partners about our role in that, and sort of starting to get the pieces in place so that it plays out in an orderly way. I think we'll probably hear more about that from the next panel.
Yes. Unless you guys had anything you want to add, I thought we might jump to the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is do one question in the room and then one from online until I run out of questions or we run out of time. And I just did want to give everyone fair warning. We would prefer questions rather than comments or statements. This is not the last event you will go to about how hard it's going to be to get to the 2035 target. So if we didn't raise your pet issue today, there will be plenty of other chances for that as well. So great. Ken.
Thanks, Alison. Ken Borden from ANU. I've got a question for Eliza, but I'll just go on for Andrew this time. So Eliza, you talked about modelling the 62 to 70%. Last week, the Net Zero Australia project released their modelling, and that's an independent think tank, for those of you who don't know them. And actually, Richard Bolt, who's the founder of Net Zero Australia, is on the board, so I'll talk to you about this. Their modelling shows that we're not likely to reach the 62 to 70% target set by the government till 2038. Till 2038. And it will probably get to 50% by 2035. Can you tell us what the difference between your modelling is and their models?
So I'm not an expert on their modelling and the assumptions under it, but that's the kind of thing that you'd want to look at. I think the broader question is about the different modelling exercises that have done related to this target and how they've contributed to where we are and the way forward from here. Because the CSIRO work that we commissioned looked at a range of scenarios, and it was one of the 5 inputs that I was talking about earlier. So none of them actually modelled the number that we recommended. It wasn't trying to work out a price tag or trying to work out, you know, a pathway. It was an assessment of different scenarios and how they compared, so that we could reflect on those and go and do the ground truthing and look at what was actually feasible and factor it into our final advice. What the Treasury's just done to feed into the government's decision on target, and they modelled a 65% target, and I think that was taken from the numbers that we consulted on as the basis. And again, it was one input into their process. It helped us, or helped them, delve into what the potential impacts were, where they might be, and start to interrogate the scenarios a bit more. The Net Zero Australia one I'm not as familiar with, but I imagine that they're looking more in where to from here, from the sound of the way you're talking about it, and what it would take to meet the target that we recommended. So I'm not sure to what extent they factored in the policy innovations that would be possible. And that was part of the analysis that we did in the sector by sector pathways, and saying how much would you need to extend or ratchet up safeguard to get the emissions down in this sector? How would we need to, what could we do to get the supply chain barrier or the workforce barrier for that emissions reduction sorted? So there was a bit of detail on the sector by sector, technology by technology, overcoming barriers analysis in ours. I'm not sure to what extent they've done it in theirs, but I guess my broader reflection is that different modelling exercises have different purposes, different assumptions, but they all tend to make a really valuable contribution to the discussion, the deliberation of where to next. So it's one that I'm looking forward to delving into more. And I think actually they've got a presentation coming up that's open to everyone. It's either later this week or early next. I saw a promotion for it yesterday.
Yeah, it was last week.
Yeah.
Was there another one coming up though?
No, they might have done. So Richard Bolt didn't talk to you about any of the modelling they did at all?
I've been involved in some of the updates along the way, but at the same time as trying to finalise our advice, and it's not something that I've delved into in a lot of detail.
Sure. I might go to the online question, and then maybe come back to your Andy question later, yeah?
Hey everyone, I'm Alina from ICEDS, but I'm representing the online audience. I won't read all the comments, of course, but to give credit to the 60 questions that have been asked online so far, I will just try and reflect briefly some of the themes that are coming across. So there has definitely been, the panel has hit some chords, I guess, with the online audience. And there has been some reflection on role of misinformation and how to overcome that. So if you want to view that into further action, I think that would be helpful. I'm going to combine a few questions to ask specifically around community consultation. So there were some questions and comments about communities that don't feel that they're being consulted well enough, and other examples where they feel like they are, but they're largely able to feel they're being consulted because of ability to lead through grassroots activism. And so I don't know whether that's a resourcing issue or something else, the consumption's there. Some questions, I guess, related to whether or whether who holds the final responsibility for incentivizing really good community consultation. Developers of energy projects often are doing community consultation, but that feels a bit of a tick box exercise. Government and community consultation can inform policy work, but I guess where does the buck stop in terms of how we govern that process and how to make sure that communities are actually feeling legitimately heard across policy and projects implemented?
How about it?
Great, love that question. Thank you, 16 people online. Look, I feel like I had been a bit of a sort of, you know, barriers and challenges guy, so I'm glad to be able to talk about where it has been done well. So the sort of the example that we often come back to and like to talk about is one of a piece of work that we did in Hay, which is in southwest New South Wales, and that the council engaged us to come in and do a piece of work with them, which was essentially a consultation exercise with both their council and the community to talk about. It had a few components, but it was a bit of what's happening here, why is there a shift to clean energy, and why is it happening in Hay, and then, you know, what are the challenges and things that people are concerned about, and just sort of shooting the breeze on some of that stuff. And then what are the things that you would like to get out of it as a fairly remote farming community in New South Wales. And so the upshot of that was that the council put together, on a basis of a few sessions that we had, a set of principles around how the community wanted to be engaged, what the processes they wanted to see were, what the opportunities that they saw for their community were. And so here, and so some of those things were, for instance, they wanted to see an airstrip out there because they're an agricultural exporting community, and an airstrip would mean they could then be doing overnight, you know, exports of fresh goods, for instance. But then there are all the other things that are common to any other community, like childcare and lack of housing and those kind of things. So that then went on to their website, and it was something the council could hand to every developer who came into town and said, okay, well, you need to consult with us. Here's a whole lot of consultation that's been done for you. You don't have to reconsult all the same people, so it cut down on the consultation fatigue. But it also gave them a sense that they were a bit in the driver's seat. They could say, if you want to come here and build something and get our assent, then this is what you've got to deliver. And so that feels like it. And the key thing about that process is that it put the community at the centre of it and said to all the projects, you deliver on what we as a community want. And all of a sudden it sort of flipped the script. Because it was a reasonably greenfield sort of renewable energy zone, in that there hadn't been a lot built at that stage. So there's not that many places in Australia where you need to build stuff where you could do that now, because there's already stuff there. But it did mean that they had the foresight to get in early and say, we want to drive this bus. We don't want it driven over us. Not quite what they said, but
Yeah. Yeah. Question here.
I'm Chief Fellow from the University. Thank you very much, Eliza, for the presentation and giving us a sense to what lay behind the targets. Now, there is obviously a lot of commentary and skepticism around whether we will actually achieve those targets or not. I am taking the more optimistic view. And my question is, if we sort of 72%, if you are able to say achieve 98% reduction, what is the economic benefit to Australia of overshooting the target by a long, long way?
I'm not sure I captured all of the question, but I think the last part was what's the economic benefit to Australia of overshooting the target?
Yeah, if it's just 72%, we are able to achieve, let's say 98%.
Yeah.
What's the economic benefit to Australia?
Good question. I'm going to take it away from what a model will tell you. And I think for Australia to go as fast and as far as possible, so what I'm picturing in my head at the moment is a chart that's showing the emissions reduction pathway. And if we go as fast as possible, and then we have a steady slope landing, like a smooth landing point.
Well, let's say tomorrow we get a hail-Mary technology,
Yeah.
which takes us steeply down the curve. What is the economic benefit to Australia of either that hail-Mary technology or the hail-Mary policy?
The economic benefit.
Economic benefit to Australia.
Well, the economic benefit of being able to decarbonise faster.
Yes, fully.
I mean, I think there's lots of different bits of work out there about this, and I mean, again, all models come back to what are your input assumptions. But for me, this is the thing that has changed a bit in the story in the last maybe decade or so, is that we've actually got a much better handle on what the benefits are of decarbonising. It's not just all about costs anymore. So I mean, you can go and look at, say, stuff that, say, the Superpower Institute has done, which is like, you know, that's kind of sketching this vision of, you know, being able to become the sort of world centre of green iron production, and that gives us a tremendous economic boost, because it's not just that we replace an economic activity that dropped away, like coal and gas exports, but actually that we gained new economic activity as well. And I mean, I think this also comes back to sort of the household story as well. Like, we've got some work that we're working on at the moment about what happens to just household energy costs between now and 2050. And they roughly halve. Like, when you add up your gas, your petrol and your electricity, like overall you're going to be spending half as much on energy as you are now. And that, to me, is like the really unsung part of this story, is that there are benefits and there are gains here. It's not just all cost. And I mean, coming back to the work you were mentioning, Ken, about the Net Zero Australia one, I think they didn't put any of the benefits side in, which is fair enough, right, in some ways, because to figure the benefits out, you have to speculate wildly about different futures. And often those speculations can drive your model. So yeah, I mean, to me, it's the bigger thing about the benefits is that this is what should be changing the politics around this, that it's becoming a story that's not just all cost. But that's a really slow process to get people to realise, I think. So yeah. Should we go to another online question if there's one?
And so, Eliza, I think you used the term fragmented frameworks earlier, and there are a lot of questions relating to the fragmentation of decision making, again, around policy at national, sub-national levels. And again, coming back to that community participation piece, I think it's important to recognise the role of private industry and developers as well. So maybe just some comments I think for everyone on the panel would be helpful. To comment on what do you see as a pathway to actually overcoming that, and in what sort of timescale, I think, with potential particular reflections, if anybody feels like sharing expertise on some of the energy hegemony issues, and whether we're just going to move from one hegemony, I guess, into another, different two-way charging arrangements, I guess different types of arrangement, maybe that's getting quite specific, that might actually help to overcome. So is it guidelines, policy frameworks, but how do we overcome that fragmentation in practice, and how do we bring communities into that?
Why don't we do one bit on like approvals and stuff between states and territories, and then maybe something else on the charging and so on. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'll jump in because I used the word first, the fragmentation language. I should say I don't think fragmentation is always bad. Like, it's not a bad thing in and of itself. And especially in the early days of a new thing or a new policy intervention being developed, it can be really helpful to experiment. across different jurisdictions or in different regions at different approaches that might work. And we see that globally with different climate policy responses in different sectors. So when we're giving the advice to the government on what it should do in a particular sector, we look at what's happening around the rest of the world and say, that's an excellent idea. We'll take that and tailor it for our circumstances. So when you allow for that level of different approaches to be, experimented and trialed, then you can, over time, as they mature a bit, you can bring them closer together later in the process, or the ones that were not successful can adopt the ones that were, and you've got a bit more redundancy and resilience that's been kind of built in. When you've got a something that's sort of reached that level of maturity and you've still got divergence and you've got inefficiencies, that's when it's time to look at how you can bring them back together. So I think we're starting to see that in some places, and the kind of benefit sharing frameworks is one of those.
Yeah, sure. Did you want to tackle anything on charging, or? We've got about 5 minutes left. So after this, I'm going to take one more question from within the room, and then we'll sort of wrap up. Yeah. So
Yeah, perhaps I'll leave it, because I think it's been said already. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. All right. That was the first hand I saw.
Have for any of the panel all have a go, but what's your number one policy or regulatory change or improvement? Number one policy or regulatory change or improvement to help us get to the upper bound of the 2035 range or beyond?
Oh, got a quick small one, which is that we have to regulate those new energy companies that are cashing in on our resources and make sure that the value share is transparent.
So I'm going to speak as me and not the CCA, but I think looking at carbon pricing is a big one. So this is somewhere where we do have fragmentation of different policy mechanisms, and I think that's appropriate across different sectors. But how do you get the price looking towards addressing the externality that it's looking for, so something closer to the social cost of carbon, but in an orderly and an economically efficient way of getting there. So that's taking a bit of a longer term view and a much more complex system than one immediate policy intervention. And I am by no means suggesting that we have a top-down emissions trading scheme introduced, but I think that that's one area that needs a lot more attention and effort dedicated to it to push us towards a more efficient system.
Andy.
I would point to the need to resource and equip regional communities to be equal partners in the transition. So we sort of think of it as like a table that's set for 3 places, and government's there, they've got a good sense of what their targets are. Industry's there, they know what projects they want to be building, but there's a seat there for communities. They're not really, no one's paying to turn up for a start, like the other 2 seats, and they don't always have the equipment and the resourcing to do it. So we've been calling for a network of local energy hubs around those areas that provide some of that resourcing and support to regional communities to raise their capacity and give them some input into these processes. It's not a fix-all sort of thing, but it's just a starting point that I think acknowledges that without the support of willing communities to be part of this transition, the whole show falls over.
I think mine would be paying a lot more attention to supply chains. Most of the changes we've made to date, we've just kind of assumed that the supply chain will be there, whether that's equipment or whether that's assume that you've got a gas network that's going to deliver you gas, or assume that you've got enough in your training system to give you enough electricians, because most of the stuff we've been doing to date has actually just been small changes at the margin, and we're not in small changes at the margin anymore, we're at big chunky changes. And so my wish list would be to pay a lot more attention to making sure you've got the system that can deliver those changes, not just, we could price carbon tomorrow, but if we don't have enough people to, well, it's super. But if you don't have enough people to you know, plant trees, rewire homes, whatever else, it'll actually end up just being a tax that we just pay, and we won't get that transformation within the economy. So, just to wrap up, I was going to ask you all, and this is a sort of similar thing, I guess, what's the one thing that gives you hope in the context of getting to the 2035 target?
Oh, look, I'll just pull out this thing that pops into my head, which is that that Rio Tinto just announced that they would bring forward the closure of the Gladstone power station. That's by 6 years. It might not happen in 2029 instead of 2035, but it might. And that's one of Australia's sort of signature companies. Well, one of those. Saying that this transition makes sense for us as a company, and we need to get behind it.
Yeah.
That could give me the hope this morning.
I'm going to go with two, but they'll be very quick. One is that we've already got the technologies. It's going to go with one. Let's stay there.
We've got the technology. Yeah. Marnie.
I'm going to go for the audience vote and say it's the ACT people who are really leading the way, showing how it's done. You know, because we're a small jurisdiction and we've had really progressive politicians here in ACT, we already achieved 100% renewable electricity a few years ago. We already have the highest rollout of electric vehicles in Australia. All our new suburbs are all electric. We're turning off gas so quickly that Evo Energy are sweating and worried. So they're having to get moving with it all. And I think it's just really inspiring and good on you guys.
And possible.
And possible.
Yeah, for sure. Well, look, thank you all very much, and thank you to the people online for their great questions, and thanks for the questions in the room as well. I have one final challenge for everybody that I want you to chew over with your coffee break and your afternoon tea. We have been talking a lot today about how do we make this easier for people, and so the challenge I'm going to put on all of you is, what are you going to do to make the net zero journey easier for everybody else? All right, thank you.
Okay, so I hope you had good discussions during the coffee. I was really enjoyed that first discussion. You know, when you talk about macro emissions reduction targets, sectoral pathways, it's very easy to disappear into a discussion about technology options, lowest cost abatement options by technology, and so on. But I think we ended up with a very good discussion, a very human-centered discussion, right? It's not about technology constraints, but rather around centering community in the transition process, right? Also, enabling trust so that home energy management systems can be used flexibly and effectively in enabling matching supply and demand for renewable energy sources, for example. Now, we are now going to really change the lens, right? From a communities and human-focused discussion. Well, there are certainly people who work in the iron ore industry, but the scale is different, right? It's not a home energy management system. We're talking about very large projects, billions of dollars, and above all, long time frames. That is, the transition pathway associated with moving to green iron and green steel, on a global basis, will take some decades, right? We do see pilot projects, right, which are emerging and which are being implemented. But of course, this topic matters enormously to Australia. Iron ore is by far our largest export product in value terms. We also export a lot of metallurgical coal as well, which is used in the steel manufacturing process. And so the discussion of how we think about enabling green steel supply chains, green iron supply chains, is a really important conversation for Australia and indeed for our trading partners as well, right? China's a little bit different, right? It has the opportunity to produce a lot of hydrogen domestically, which could be used in the direct reduction of iron, for example. But countries like Japan and South Korea have far fewer options to produce bulk volumes of hydrogen domestically. Taiwan as well, actually, who we trade quite a bit of iron ore and met coal with. So there's really a kind of opportunity here to think about how to unlock and enable that. There are cost implications, right? A gap, a green premium, if you like, between business as usual steel production processes and green steel production processes. There are really important locational decisions around this. If you've read the 2019 hydrogen strategy, you'll see, you know, that initially thought that the model might be, you know, us exporting hydrogen and ammonia, perhaps as a derivative of hydrogen, as a molecule, right? So putting it on ships, liquefying it maybe, as we were looking at in Victoria, or using ammonia as a carrier, easier to transport than hydrogen. But that conversation has moved on a little bit, and I think you'll see a stronger focus now on value-added products, right? And the biggest of those is green iron and steel. That really involves questions about our trade and investment relationships with our partners. So we've got a really terrific panel here to help think through the range of issues, both technology issues, as well as economic and cost issues, as well as policy issues, how to crowd in private capital, for example, to enable first investment decisions to be made on green iron and steel projects. Okay, so it's a mix of technology discussion, techno-economic discussion, and also policy discussion. I'm going to introduce our 4 speakers now and then ask them to come up. Each of them has a presentation, so it's a little different to the first panel where it was fully discussion driven. So they're going to introduce some information to you using slides, show you some of the work that's going on and how you can think about this issue. The first presenter will be Jorrit Horsens. He is here at the ANU's Center for Climate and Energy Policy, or CCEP, and he also has a role within the Heavy Industry Low Carbon Transition CRC, or Cooperative Research Center. It's a big cooperative research center working on heavy industry decarbonisation. Jorrit took his PhD in environmental economics and management from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and does a lot of work on China and China-related energy transition issues. Here with us at the ANU, he's building models of energy and resource markets, and a particular focus on Australia-China trade, and right now a particular focus on green iron and steel trade and investment between Australia and China, and he'll present some of that work to us. After Jorrit, Victor Pantano is going to speak. Victor is the director of the ANU Rio Tinto partnership. It's a large partnership that exists here at the ANU. It's been great getting to know Victor actually over the last, since I've come into the role as director of the Institute and visit his lab. They've got he's going to show you 2D versions of some very cool 3D characterization of iron ore cores. We sadly can't afford to give everyone virtual reality goggles, so you could all see it in the full 3D. But he'll talk to us about the work that they're doing over there in providing a cost-effective way of characterizing iron ore cores in 3D to look at how they might behave under different combustion technologies. Okay. So after we've had those 2 presentations, we'll have a couple of presentations which will focus on more of the policy discussion. Firstly, Nicole Jacek-Martin, who's the executive manager at ASFI, of the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute. ASFI is doing a lot of work on sustainable finance standards in order to, as one mechanism or approach for helping unlock private capital. Because it's definitely the case you can't transition the iron ore sector without private capital at many multiples of whatever government might choose to spend in terms of subsidies and so on. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Carmela Pavlik-Searle, who leads the energy diversification section within the Trade and Investment Group within our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. As was alluded to by Eliza, as I've mentioned as well, partnerships, and particularly partnerships with our major trading partners, in Northeast Asia, but also Germany and elsewhere, are absolutely crucial to enabling offtake agreements and realizing this opportunity. We have to work together rather than kind of try and solve this problem for ourselves, because they're global supply chains after all. So each of them will come up, and then there will be a panel which will be run by Emma Aisbert, and I'm delighted that Emma is able to join us. So Emma is a colleague here at the College of Law, Governance and Policy, and does a large amount of work on a wide range of different issues around the energy transition. Emma played a key role in the zero carbon exports for the Asia Pacific projects that we ran for many years and helped drive some of this discussion of low carbon exports. And Emma's doing a lot of work on embedded emissions accounting now, which is a key part of the policy architecture we're also going to require to enable this opportunity. So Emma's going to chair and hopefully say a couple of things as well about the work and how it fits in with the other parts of the discussion. But for now, I'd like to ask Joris to come up and share his remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thanks for that. Right, so I will talk about, and I'll move myself out of the way here a little bit, about the exports of iron ore and green iron from Australia to China, specifically into green steel making value chains. For those that are not familiar with the concept just yet, this is sort of a visual representation of the idea. We have currently here on the left, Australia sending a lot of iron ore to China for processing into iron and steel in China. We believe that with our really very good renewable energy resources, we could downstream in the future, either into iron making, and at some point we were considering steel making as well. So to make green iron or green steel. Currently, the focus is very much on that step of iron making, with exports of iron to China for steel making there. So downstreaming as a result of the energy transition. Importantly, I think to mention in this whole process, there's a myth, I think I should call it, a storyline that Australian iron ores are not very suited for green steel making. That is a myth that needs to stop being told. Our iron ores are very suited for the blast furnace process, which is the dirty process. And it is true that the hydrogen direct reduction combined with electric arc furnace processes are better suited to very high grade ores. There is, however, a third way, which is the electric smelting furnace route, which melts the iron ore, so it separates the impurities very efficiently, and that iron can then be used in either the basic oxygen furnace or electric arc furnace routes. In any case, it is very possible to use our relatively low-grade Australian iron ores in green steel routes, and a little bit more on that in my results. I will actually just skip this. I will skip the methods of the model quite a bit. I think what's important to mention is what we do is we have an optimization model. For folks that this is familiar for, I don't need to say too much. What we effectively do is we say we have a number of suppliers, so iron ore mines, that supply a given demand, so that will be steel mills in this model, and we ask the model to look at the least costly way to do that. That is how efficient markets operate, so that replicates real world markets. Importantly, and what sets our model really quite apart from all the very many iron models that try to do the same thing, apart, is that we integrate engineering models into this economic model. So we look at the different processes for all sorts of preparation step, iron making and steel making. And we ask, or we model how consumption of energy, hydrogen, flux, etc., and losses of iron depend on the composition of the specific iron ores that we put into those processes, recognizing that Australian iron ores are very different in their composition than those found in Brazil or in China. That matters a lot for the cost and for the outcomes. And so again, this is where our model really sets itself apart from the competition. And then, so straight into results, we asked the model, suppose that there is a world, the year is 2035, China is the only market that demands any steel, and all of the steel that it demands is green. Who would be supplying the iron ore, or I should say the iron that goes into that process? As a first sort of baseline, we say, let's assume that Australian hydrogen is about as costly as the Chinese hydrogen. So there's what we call price parity between Chinese hydrogen production cost and Australian hydrogen production cost. And what the model tells us then is that basically about 3/4 of iron production would still happen in China. It would use Australian iron ores, but the iron production step would occur in China. It would import roughly 1/4 from Brazil or Chile, but Australia would not be a competitive iron producer. That changes a lot when we start to vary the costs. So if we ask it, what if we in Australia could produce hydrogen at just about half an Australian dollar cheaper per kilogram of hydrogen than the Chinese would? And then our model shows that really roughly half of all iron that China would consume would actually be produced in Australia and sent to China for processing into steel. And that ramps up with bigger cost differences between Australia and China. Then, so the same figure that I showed before, we also asked the model via what process route would you process different iron ores? And again, so pointing to that electric smelter furnace as a technology that could be developed particularly for low-grade Australian ores. And the result is, so this is the ESF, the electric smelter furnace. This is the electric arc furnace route. And the model tells us that it'll happily process mostly Brazilian and Russian, really, iron ores via the electric arc furnace route, but really that the very large bulk of Australian iron ores would need to be processed via the electric smelter furnace, sort of giving a first indication of the importance of that technology. Then we do the same sort of exercise. We say, let's suppose that the year is 2035. China is the only market demanding any green steel, and it demands all of its steel to be green. Who would be supplying the iron ore, in this case, that goes into that steel making? Then the model tells us that if we have about 100 million tons of electric smelter furnace capacity in China, there'd be, well, roughly a little over 100 million tons of Australian iron ore consumed. Currently, we supply roughly 80% of what is supplied in China, so that'd be a pretty big drop. As the smelter furnace capacity increases, so does the demand for Australian iron ores. One thing to note is that there's no result for the first 2 bars, so for 0 or 50 million tons of smelter furnace capacity. That is because there is not enough high-grade quality iron ore in the world, our model says, to supply Chinese green steel production if there is not enough smelter furnaces available. So really, the smelter furnace is of very large importance for green steel making, and in particularly also for the use of Australian iron ores is really tied to the development of that smelter furnace technology. So that's really sort of the key points from our model. First, relative hydrogen production costs will really drive where green iron will be produced. If we want to have substantial amounts of green iron produced in Australia for export to China, then our hydrogen production costs need to be a bit lower than what they do in China, about half an Australian dollar. That reflects really that all our other costs, so capital costs and labor, et cetera, are a bit higher than they are in China. That means that we really need to get on with making sure that our renewable energy resources are developed in very cheap ways. And secondly, I've said it a few times, the electric smelter furnace technology, which is currently still in very low levels of development, needs to be stimulated in order to ensure that we keep seeing very high levels of Australian iron ore consumed, in particular in green steel making value chains. So again, this is in particular for the Pilbara ores, so the low grade hematite ores, but that's the bulk of Australian ores. That really means that we need to develop that technology. In particular, if we think of our customers, they have the option to not use Australian ores and use higher grade ores via different pathways. If we want to ensure that Australian ores are consumed, then we need to make sure that this technological route is developed. That's really sort of where we are with the research at the moment. And I'll just be very short in our model development, but it's too much to go over for today. But we're planning an expansion of this model to sort of global markets, a good bit more detail, and we'll be asking the model what we can do with policy settings in order to sort of enable the outcomes that we would like to see, that we could have cheap enough hydrogen and strong enough development of the electric smelter furnace technology. So I'll leave it there, and then I think
Thanks, Jerry. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about something quite specific, a specific technology that we've been developing here at the ANU, as well as a bit of a partnership with Rio Tinto. So we're going to be talking about ORAI, as we've named it, and we've been developing this with Rio Tinto. And as the slide title suggests, we think this could be an approach that we might use to help future-proof the Pilbara. So actually, it was really good that Llewelyn went first because he covered some of the challenges that we have with the Pilbara, particularly in terms of our iron ores and the mixture of iron ores and gangue, and then being suitable to the different pathways. Llewelyn had that very complicated diagram that we see quite often, which shows the different pathways moving forward, and that's what we're all trying to grapple with, steelmakers are trying to grapple with. So depending on which technology pathway you go through would depend on the iron content and the gangue mix. I think another issue that we have in Australia is that for decades we've been mining the same way, which is what I call bulk mining. We take a bench, we blow it up. You might have seen lots of photos of explosives blowing up an entire bench. We scoop it up, put it on a train, take it to port, send it to a steelmaker, China, Japan, Korea. They put it in a blast furnace. The blast furnace is quite forgiving. You add some coal and you get steel. So we're thinking of a paradigm in the future where we need to move to more what we call teaspoon mining. So how might ORAI fit into that? So ORAI is a platform that we hope will allow us to develop different Pilbara products. So think of customized blends of iron ore that can be supplied to our iron ore customers that are using different green steel technologies. So Yorick pointed out the different technologies that might be available. And in fact, there are more technologies that people are investing in to try and develop. So we want to work to develop different product streams that we can supply to any green steel technology. So how does ORAI do that? So at its core, we use computed tomography technology that was developed here at the ANU. So computed tomography technology is X-ray technology. So at ANU, we've spent the last 20 years developing this X-ray technology. We're the world leaders in micro CT or micro X-ray technology, particularly for geologic materials. So we generate these 3D images like the one that you see here. So this was generated here at the ANU from Pilbara ore. The dark red that you see is hematite and the light is goethite. You heard Yorick talk about hematite and goethite. They're the two main components of Pilbara ore. So we have here at the ANU the largest CT in Australia that images iron ore, and we're about to build 2 new iron ore dedicated CT machines, which will be the largest in Australia and the largest in the Southern Hemisphere, to help us generate these images. So why are these images important? So these images, these 3D images, form what I call a scaffold or a backbone. So they're a 3D image, and what we then do is we can take 1D data, so think of measurements on rocks. We can take 2D data, so think of a microscope or an electron microscope. We can take very exquisite high-resolution images. Using these SEMs, we can quantify exactly what the minerals are in the ore, and we can also take process data. So process data, I'm going to show you a little bit of process data later. But in our CT, we can actually look at how the iron ore breaks. So we can watch it actually break. We can see how all the different bits of iron ore break, which is important because we want to know how the ore beneficiates. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And the other thing we can do is we can actually look at what happens to the ore when it's reduced. So we can put it in hydrogen, we can reduce it at 1,000 degrees, and we can watch what actually happens. So we can take all that data and we can use our 3D scaffold and we can embed or fuse all of that together. So that's the data fusion step there. And ANU has a lot of experience and a lot of IP in this process, and we can create this exquisite high quality training data. We then apply machine learning to that, and over thousands and thousands of samples, we can develop what I call a digital fingerprint of a mine. So we get to get a picture of what's in the mine and where. So from this fingerprint, we can start to understand across the mine where all the different ore types are, the mineralogy, the porosity, all things that are very important in determining which pathway that ore is suitable for. We can then start to use AI to predict how we might extract the right bits from the right area of the mine, how we might optimize its breaking, so it's beneficiation. So beneficiation is a step where you break the ore open to try and access the different parts of the ore that might be beneficial to a certain green steel pathway, how we might blend those ores, and importantly, how those ores will react or how they will behave under different green steel processing pathways. All this with the end customer in mind. So what does that provide? Basically, what we're aiming for is be able to track ore as it moves from the mine all the way through to the steelmaker. We want to be able to predict how that ore will behave even before it's been mined. And most importantly, we want to be able to create bespoke ore products engineered for any future green steel process. So Yorick talked about the economics. We're technologists, so not interested in the economics, but what we're interested in is enabling what kind of product we need to supply to whatever our customer, whatever green steel technology pathway they choose, whatever is most economical, we want to be able to supply that product to them. So we're trying to channel our technology to enable this customized approach. So I talked a little bit about the process data. So I'm going to show you a little bit here of that process data. I could show you the crushing as well, but I haven't chosen that one. I've chosen this one instead. So how does iron ore react in hydrogen reduction? So on the left here, on your left, basically that's a piece of iron ore from the Pilbara. In the middle is goethite, and the two outer layers are hematite. And we've taken an image of the iron ore. You can only see it in 2D here, but we have it in 3D. We've taken an image of the iron ore before. We then take it out. We put it in a furnace here at the ANU. We heat it up in hydrogen to 1,000 degrees, turns to iron, which is reduced there on the right. And if I play it, so this is what actually happens after. So you can see the middle layer there has essentially shrunk. So it's dehydrated because the goethite has a lot of water in it. It's dehydrated, it's shrunk, and it's essentially like a clay. So what will happen is if we stick this into a furnace, that middle layer there will collapse and it will pulverize and it will clog up the furnace. So the middle layer there is not suitable for that kind of green steel pathway. So it would be something that you would seek to remove before you went through that process. So the slide said first time ever seen, and that's basically because when we showed the Japanese steelmakers and some of the Chinese steelmakers, they've never had this insight before. So at the moment when they do these tests, they throw some iron ore in the top, they have to wait for it to come out the bottom, and then they visually inspect it. They don't actually know what happens. They don't understand the behavior. So this kind of technology can enable that to happen, can give them these insights. And it could be that ores that we think are not green steel suitable could actually be green steel suitable. So I wanted to spend sort of the last 2 slides just talking about the partnership aspects, given the topic of the panel. So how did we come to developing this technology? This is an example sort of a different era, but in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, we put together an energy consortium, has had the world's largest energy companies there, and it was based here at the ANU. We had 25 to 30 companies at its peak, all contributing to the development of this CT technology, which became digital rock technology. And ANU is the global founder of digital rock technology. So they helped us develop this CT technology upon which ORAI is now built. So we're transitioning it into mining, focusing it on green steel. So our idea now is to do the same sort of thing with Rio Tinto, but in green steel. So we're starting to talk to Rio Tinto's customers, their customers for Australia's iron ore, about putting together a similar consortium to be hosted here at the ANU. So we see ORAI as a collaborative platform to bring together the global steelmakers to support their green steel journey. So we think the platform allows them to get access to technology that allows them to understand how iron ore behaves in green steel processes, but it also gives them an unprecedented view of the iron ore supply chain. So they can now see all the way back to what's in the ground and be able to track things through to the steelmaking plant. That's the vision. So the partnership with Rio Tinto has been really important to us. It's allowed us to transition this technology platform that we created at the ANU into mining and specifically into green steel. It's enabled knowledge transfer both ways, and that's been really important. So we have a research group that doesn't speak mining. They're physicists, they're engineers, they're mathematicians. So working with Rio Tinto has enabled us to understand their language and understand their challenges. And Rio Tinto have embedded themselves in our research group. So we have a number of subject matter experts from around Rio Tinto who are part of our research group. Many of them are doing PhDs with us, which is helping with that knowledge transfer. And Rio Tinto is funding the development of an ORAI pilot facility here at the ANU, where we'll be able to scale up and do the analysis on what we hope will be thousands of samples and start to build these mine scale digital fingerprints. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Right. We've been talking a lot today about some really exciting technologies, all of which have to be funded. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we pay for all of this, and how we really kind of mobilize private capital to get our industries going. A little bit about who we are, the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute. We are a member-based not-for-profit organisation comprising 40 of Australia's largest financial institutions across the full finance sector value chain, which is really important because the work that we're doing is really about trying to drive systems change across the finance sector so that capital can be mobilised and allocated towards a sustainable, resilient and inclusive Australia. The system currently, and I think we all know it, is very much geared towards short-termism and profits. There are a lot of reasons why private capital is not getting to where we want it to get to, even though there is a longer-term profitability model on the other end. And so the work that we're doing is really trying to shift and change that. So why are we doing what we're doing? I think we all know that the financing gap to get to our net zero commitments is enormous. We're focusing today on green iron and steel. That alone has got a significant investment opportunity attached to it. Some people like to talk about the costs, but in finance land, it's good.
I'm trying to get this out of the way.
Okay, thank you. We like to talk about the investment opportunity. That needs to increase exponentially. The important thing to note, and this is especially true in countries like Australia and other developed economies, is that private capital is going to do the majority of the heavy lifting when it comes to mobilizing capital to commercialize our new industries. To date, 82% of all clean energy investments in advanced economies have come from the private sector. We know that government expenditure is increasingly going to be split, not only in terms of trying to support economies to transition, but also importantly deal with the impacts of climate change that's already locked in. And so there's not a lot to go around. And so we need to really be thinking about the little bit of public capital that we have, how we use it to crowd in as much private capital as we can. So we think a lot about why capital isn't flowing, and there are a range of barriers. I'm not going to go into all these two little dots, but these are all the things that we think about on a daily basis and are looking at ways to try and shift the system. But I can generally divide them into three buckets. There's a bucket around policy, which in a lot of instances can help with the supply side. It can also help with the demand side, so we can talk about that. But the supply and demand parts, markets don't just happen, right? They are created through good enabling policies that then facilitate the flow of capital to where we want it to be. So supply side mechanisms, both in terms of certainty of targets, and I know the previous panel spoke about this, some of the other pricing mechanisms that we have, and we need to see more of those flowing through the system, the Future Made in Australia, these are all good starts, but I think there's obviously more that needs to be done. There's then the demand side, which we'll touch on a little bit, which is really, I think, Eliza on the previous panel touched on this. We actually need to start working in partnership with our future off-takers to start to shore up that demand for the future green steel industry. This is not going to happen on its own, or at least not at the time and at the speed required for us to meet our commitments. And then there's something in the middle, which, a lot of people don't understand, is that even with those price dynamics in place, the mobilization of capital is something that needs a bit of a nudge, right? We like to talk about it. I head up our work on standards and practice. We say we're the plumbers in the system, right? Capital flows. We need to make sure that that plumbing is in place to make that capital flow in the most efficient and effective way. We need the information architecture to be such that there is no room for arbitrage in the system, and so that the cost of capital can come down and we can get it going to the places that it needs to go. And it's a very obvious example. We think about if we're doing something new, right, the status quo for all of us is that we'll continue to do the things that we know. And it's really hard for us to start to move into something new, for example, EVs or other things. We need a bit of a nudge. And it's the same with the finance sector. It needs the enabling environment to give it the nudge to start those investments, cut the first deal, and then replicate that over time. So a little bit about that demand side. As we recently published a report with Kaya Partners, which really spoke about leveraging our kind of strategic partnerships to shore up our future investment. I'm not going to go into the why. I think we all understand and realize the vulnerability of our current export profile. The scale and speed of that vulnerability will depend on a whole lot of factors, but I think the direction of travel is clear. And there's enough transition risk in the system for us to know that that we are going to get to a point where we need to be shoring up new export industries. I think one thing that has changed over the last couple of years is economics is now on the side of the green transition. And so I can anticipate that that acceleration is going to increase at a rate that it hasn't to date. What we really want to do is say, what is Australia's sustainable export strategy? And we've identified sort of two key parts of that. The one is our existing trade partners, and I think the other speakers have spoken a lot about them. China, Japan, South Korea, they're looking for a decarbonisation solution. We're looking to be the new green powerhouse. We really need to start thinking about what that coordination looks like. We have done this before. There has been a massive Team Australia coordinated moment that happened in the late 80s and the early 90s as we shored up our export industries for our current commodities. We can do it again, working on joint transition plans, working across with our trade partners to actually shore up the orderly transition of their energy needs, our new export industries to realize those opportunities. And then importantly, on the other side of the coin, we have the emerging markets in Southeast Asia, which are our future markets. They are at the cusp of that energy transition, and the decisions they make now and the capital investments that they make now will determine the next 50 years of their emissions profile. And so working really collaboratively with them to support the capital investment that is needed for them to have a decarbonised future will shore up our future industries. So that leaves us with that bit in the middle, which is how do we support the finance industry, the supply and the demand to get that inertia up the system and get capital flowing. And this is where the role of standards really becomes important. So probably something a lot of you in this room won't know about. Australia published its sustainable finance taxonomy in June, which we developed in partnership with the Australian government. And I won't get into the boring details, but I like to say it's the shopping list for the future. It really identifies a whole bunch of economic activities at an activity or an asset or project level that are aligned to a Paris-aligned decarbonisation scenarios, as well as all the capital investment measures that will help you to become aligned. So we talk about that as transition finance. It is built on the scenarios that we've spoken a lot about, taking a bottom-up approach about what are the individual component parts across the key sectors that we know are going to help decarbonize the economy. And what it does is develop a classification system that says across 6 sectors of the economy, including mining, minerals, and metals, which is the first taxonomy in the world to do that, there are not only identifying what a low or zero emissions mining, manufacturing, and processing looks like, but also what the decarbonisation pathway for that looks like. So I think I'm out of time, but what I will just do is give examples of what that looks like in practice. It gives you a set of criteria for a decarbonised mine. That's not to say that many mines will be able to meet this, although there are a few that actually would. But importantly, what it also does is identify the huge capital investment and expenditure that's happening at the moment that my other colleagues spoke about, that we really need private capital to mobilise behind. And this creates a common language to be able to structure financing and transactions that will be able to get private finance in the market. So I might leave it there. That's on the manufacture of iron steel, and happy to chat later.
Thank you. Everyone needs Jeremy in their life. And while that's getting set up, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I'm standing and any elders past, present, or emerging in the audience or online. And I might just start because I'm conscious of time. Hi, government speaker, last one of the day. Let's go. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, Llewelyn, in a session that's been quite extraordinary. Thank you. Eliza kindly established the context for what I'll address, and that's the government has accepted the Climate Change Authority's recommended target of a 62 to 70% reduction in emissions below 2005 levels by 2035. If we look at just steelmaking and its supply chains, that accounts for 7 to 9% of global emissions. As Yorick pointed out, current minerals extractions and metal manufacturing is also responsible for a significant portion of the world's emissions. So decarbonising priority metals industries would make a tangible contribution to the net zero transition, as they collectively represent about 13% of global and direct and indirect carbon emissions. Decarbonising steel supply chains will be essential to emissions reductions globally. Our challenge is achieving this whilst future-proofing our significant resources industry. As Eliza alluded to, it's flipping that narrative from being a net exporter of emissions to a net exporter of abatement. How do we do that? Today, Australia's 150 billion metals industry is a cornerstone of our export economy. It supports nearly 200,000 jobs across alumina, aluminium, iron, steel, and related sectors. Australia is the world's largest producer of iron ore, both hematite and magnetite, the world's largest producer of bauxite, projected to be the second largest global producer and largest exporter of alumina by the end of 2025, and is expected to produce 49% of the world's high purity alumina. Globally, the steel and aluminium industries are driven by urbanisation, infrastructure development, and demand for lightweight materials, particularly in the transportation and construction sectors. Both materials are critical inputs for the net zero transformation to produce wind turbines, solar panels, and electric vehicles. The need for metals and the desire for our key trading partners to continue to manufacture them will not diminish. As outlined by the WWF, the government acknowledges Australia's exports are exposed to the energy transition, and we will need to diversify. And you raised that just before, thank you. We must adapt to rising global and domestic demand for low emissions materials and to safeguard economic security while managing the transition to achieve our agreed climate goals. We must embrace Australia's green metals opportunity. By harnessing our renewable energy to produce green metals, we can create resilient supply chains, secure critical industries, and position Australia as a trusted and global supplier in a rapidly changing world. And if I may use a great phrase that I heard last week at a Green Metals event in Osaka, the green metals opportunity is an evolution, not a revolution, of our trade relationship. It has many of the same ingredients applied in a new trade, technological and environmental dynamic. Australia has the potential to become a world leader in green metals production. This is why green metals are a priority sector under the Future Made in Australia National Interest Framework. Now, with thanks to my colleagues at DISA, this slide provides an overview of what Australia has to offer in the global pursuit for green metals. We have an abundance of high quality resources, a skilled labour force, stable policy environment, and enormous renewable energy potential. And as Victor's work exemplifies, Australia also has the capacity to innovate. We have strong foundations to realise green metals as a generational opportunity. And we are seizing this opportunity through the Future Made in Australia agenda, backed by more than 22 billion commitments over the next decade. This includes a commitment of nearly 4 billion to support green iron, green aluminium, and the demonstration of novel green metals technologies. And apologies again for the list of what government is doing, but here it is. It includes $1 billion in the Green Iron Investment Fund, 2 billion green aluminium production credit, 750 million allocated under the Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund, and the 10 million Green Metals Innovation Network. But whilst we are doing a lot to secure a green metals future, it will take more than a unilateral policy setting by our government to make it a reality. Cooperation and partnerships between governments is key to building awareness of the opportunities these new industries represent. Strategic international partnerships can underpin momentum towards change through signalling clear direction of travel to investors. Australia wants to work with our trading partners to reduce emissions from hard-to-abate sectors such as iron and steel and other metals. This decarbonisation agenda also presents a strategic opportunity for us to supply green metals and support the region to reduce emissions. And it is central to agreeing trade standards and norms to enable these new industries to exist and compete with carbon-intensive alternatives. Australia has signed a range of bilateral climate and energy partnerships with an agreement to cooperate on green metals. And the slide earlier showed Japan, Korea, Germany, and quite a number of countries that we're working with. And we're looking at these relationships with a novel lens, seeking opportunity that may not have existed previously. For example, Australia and Germany's bilateral agreement has a Sioux Steel program working to assess the technical feasibility of a green metals value chain. And we're hoping to see the outcomes of that report shortly, but that will provide valuable data to support discussions with other trade partners and confidence in the feasibility of this new industry to our investors. During a recent trip to China, our Prime Minister agreed to establish a steel decarbonisation dialogue with China as the world's largest steel producer and a key export market for Australian iron ore. Flip to that slide. This was a key outcome of that trip. We need to work with China on steel decarbonisation to ensure a sustainable steel sector and to build a future that keeps Australian jobs and our economy strong. The dialogue will support this goal by creating a forum for further discussions and support the many existing efforts of industry, build consensus, and identify opportunities for tackling the decarbonisation challenge. The new Green Economy Partnership Arrangement on Climate and Energy between the Republic of Korea and Australia also talks specifically about collaboration on green metals, with actions outlined in the action plan that sits underneath that. And I've just returned from Japan, where we had preliminary, it's a long day, discussions on what a similar dialogue might look like with Japan. Ultimately, these partnerships should be a win-win for both countries. Australia to make the most of its renewable energy superpower, but working with our key trading countries to understand what the value proposition looks like to them. Where in the value chain do we want to sit? Where in the supply chain are we going to cooperate? Countries such as Japan, India, China, and the Republic of Korea have limited adequate renewable resources and competing clean energy demand across other uses that restrict competitiveness in producing green iron. There is opportunity to work together. And this is work that is happening right now across government to understand the new opportunities that exist. These partnerships also provide opportunities to develop new technologies and to discuss technical definitions and standards. Nicole has already made the case for establishing and harmonising standards to enable the investment and financing necessary to revolutionise iron and steel processing. And through the process, it's worth asking, what is green metal? And I'm looking at Emma because I know she's been asking this question for many years already. It's ultimately through partnerships and cooperation at international forums where these issues can be agreed. Through ongoing dialogue and engagement, we can work to find common agreement to standards and methods to measure and report. There are many questions that can be resolved through these conversations, like how green is green? What other inputs used, such as hydrogen or electricity, require standards and regulations to meet the threshold for green material? These discussions are fundamental components of facilitating international trade and de-risking international investment. Working with our partners is core to enabling these new industries. And by decarbonising the cornerstone of our economy and moving up the value chain to manufacture metals like iron, Australia has an opportunity to decarbonise the heavy industries of our key trading partners also. As the Superpower Institute emphasises, and we've also said throughout the afternoon, exporting Australia's renewable energy embodied in green metals can assist our trade partners lift the productivity of their heavy manufacturing sectors and increase their energy security, So this is beyond just sectors. Energy security is economic security. We've already made comments about the fact that there's foreign policy implications, and I sit in the trade area, but you know, the two are closely aligned. Foreign policy and trade and economic security are fundamental in all of these conversations. So in the end, Australia can't realise the green metals objectives without partners, but it is our partners and the rest of the world who stand to gain just as much from our success. Australia's genuine advantages, geological, metallurgical, geographical and geopolitical, make us well positioned to play a key role in strengthening future metal supply chains and to be indispensable in the net zero global economy. And as Eliza also so beautifully put, to be the exporter of solutions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Camilla. That was 4 geos and not geoeconomics. I mean, congratulate you, given it's the title on many presentations we see these days. It's 5 o'clock, and I know that we were scheduled to run until 5, and we came back from coffee a little late. So I'd like to ask your indulgence to run for about 15 more minutes so that we can have a panel discussion led by Emma. There is a door up the back if you need to. I know people have to pick up children and those kinds of things. So you're welcome to do that if you need to do so. With that, let me pass the floor to Emma, and we have about 15 minutes for discussion and a couple of questions.
Thanks. Yeah, I think right. Actually, in light of how late it is, I actually thought we might throw, if anyone has a question in the audience, in respect of people's time, if you're staying back, yeah, we can go straight to that.
With respect. With respect to with respect to expectations of iron and steel exports, I think it'd be useful to touch on the realism that currently we only have very small steel iron producing capacity in Guyana, 2 blast furnaces at Port Kembla, down from 6 a couple of decades ago, and no new iron smelting capacity coming up in Australia. Even if you do develop the technology and IP, you recapture the value, just like it happened with solar cells. The initial R&D was done at USW, but we are not producing any solar cells. So is it worth the Commonwealth spending those $10 billion, $50 billion grants to this industry when it is expected to produce only 10% of the entire production to be green by 2050? Apologies for the
Thanks.
right away.
Oh, good. Who would like? I think possibly everyone on the panel would like to answer that. And it does get to the heart of things. Did you want to start first, Jared?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the being able to capture these industries in a resilient way, it's a completely different story than the solar manufacturing industry, because it's not about IP, which can sort of cross borders very easily. It's about local factors, including, very importantly, the renewable energy resources. So that's where we hope some of the competitiveness would come from. The key driver really has to be that we can generate cheap renewable electricity. That will generate our competitive advantage, and we have to sort of battle up against disadvantages in labor costs and labor availability at this point.
Can it be realistically manufacture anything in Australia cheaper than in China?
Sorry, I'm just aware it's late in the day. Thank you. Did anyone else?
I would just say that as far as the international collaborations are concerned, we need to have the conversations now. Like, yes, the projects are years, possibly decades in the making, but the time is now to have those conversations and to start aligning our interests and to make sure that we have the frameworks, financing, that everything, and to ensure that investors then have confidence to make those massive investments into our country. So we should be doing all that we can right now. Go hard, go fast. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Excellent. And you didn't say the word geo.
I'm so sorry.
And that is, I think, the obvious question, you know, or the obvious, one of the obvious answers to the question of can't China do everything cheaper? Possibly. And your shows that a few factors are still in play that might determine that. Does the entire world want China to be the only supplier of green metals? Will there be other markets, people wanting to diversify? I think the answer is there will be diversity demanded by global markets. Does anyone else want to add another question? I think Victor, if I might take chair's prerogative, your work, I'm a trade economist, is one of the hats I wear, and it looks beautifully to me like you're developing new services, trade, exports for Australia. So a lot of what your technology is doing looks to me like the sort of thing that the iron and steel makers might traditionally have done themselves. They source their ore, they figure out what, you know, how best to optimize their process. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're essentially taking that part of the supply chain using knowledge capital, Australian knowledge capital and innovation, and kind of drawing it back to Australia. Is that the way you see your work?
That could be one way to see the work. I guess the way that we see it moving forward is that with our technology, we would like to make it available to steel producers to use. So we've already been asked several times if it can be bought. It can't be bought, but we're happy to make it available to steel producers to help them optimize their processes, their technologies. They're all in the process of trying different green steel technologies. They all know they have to transition. So we want to make this technology available to help them with that transition. We don't want to make any bets on where things are going to be manufactured. We want to make sure that wherever it's manufactured, we can continue to supply. There was the slide you showed that had that 52%. I guess I want to make sure that that 52% stays as large as possible moving into the future. And that's where I'm trying to position us and our technology moving forward.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So this all comes down to matching cost with the price people are prepared to pay. And we've seen the recent government announcement of the hydrogen global tender scheme, where that's happening between Australia and Germany, trying to, you know, find some common price that we can move towards from both ends. So the question is, first of all, I guess, probably for Carl, are we going to see something like that for green iron? So I don't think anyone's surprised we do that for green steel. For green iron, might be a possibility. And then for Europe. So really this comes down to, from Australia's perspective, are the costs of the extra electric steel furnace or the beneficiation alternative, which is what Victor was really alluding to, are those cost differentials going to price us out of the competition with countries like Brazil? So in other words, what is the sensitivity to your modelling for the ESF step in the process?
I'll start. There is work and studies that are being conducted on some kind of trading platforms for green iron, using the model with Germany, as was alluded to earlier. You know, it's good to test. All of this is new industries and working out what, you know, how we can test policies and what might work to create the market. So I'm aware of research that's being conducted that looks at something similar. We'll look at how the work proceeds with Germany. That will further inform whether that could be replicated. But at this point, the more information we can get about systems that work, we're just kind of digesting that, and then that'll turn into whatever the policy solution will become.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I completely understood, but I mean, there's difference, or we have to look at the hydrogen production cost in sort of the demand markets as well as different suppliers, right? And what we've assessed so far is that China is probably the most competitive, but Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India, Southeast Asia, Europe would all have higher hydrogen production costs than Australia would. So in that sense, we are very competitive. It may very well be true that the Brazilians would also be able to supply iron at a pretty competitive rate. Exactly, we're working on developing effectively global supply cost curves. So it will not be a matter of where does Australia sit, it'll be a matter of where do different Australian deposits sit, including, for example, different magnetite deposits in northern Tasmania or Whyalla that might sit quite low. Whereas a large hematite deposits in the Pilbara might sit quite high. That's something that we're still trying to figure out. In terms of sensitivities, it is quite sensitive. I mean, half a Australian dollars at 35 US cents, and it flicks from 0 to 400 million tons of supply. So there's an enormous amount of sensitivity in the model. So something also that we'll try and figure out what levers there or what elements cause sensitivity in the model other than the hydrogen price. Still something to be figured out still. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we're very close to extended time. So Evelina online.
So I'm going to ask a question online that is related to the comments about supply chain, I think, and learning and how we need to learn now for the future. The question is specifically around hydrogen, but essentially asks, how can we be informed in order to apply, the knowledge that we have already to the potential for hydrogen, green steel, etc., in the next 20 years. The commentary reflects that hydrogen has been a bit not yet ready for a little while, and if we continue in that discourse, what are the specific tactics, I guess, for learning? What can we learn about forging relationships among strange bedfellows in a value chain from other parts of industry, I suppose, that can be applied to hydrogen, green steel, and content?
That was quite the online comment. Thank you. Does anyone?
Shall I have a crack?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm just trying to remember it. So I think like Australia is not alone, and you'll find that a lot of the challenges and opportunities we're facing are global challenges and opportunities. So there's a lot that we're all learning as we go. But from the hydrogen perspective, I think it's not that we're not learning from it. In fact, I would say it's the opposite. If you look at the progress of hydrogen, the Australian hydrogen strategy, but also internationally, we're really refining the end use case. So it's not just hydrogen's all singing, all dancing, let's go. It's really becoming an understanding that it's going to take a portfolio of technologies and pathways to be able to hit net zero. And in the hydrogen's case, we are really refining how that contribute as part of that portfolio. So I actually think as we are moving through, and like it's a new industry as well, this is the other data we can take from is, the gas industry, other new industries that have started, particularly say the gas industry between Australia and Japan. There are lessons we can learn about how we approach that can be replicated in the clean energy transition.
I think the question is maybe looking for what are some of the specific lessons that we can learn that can be applied.
I think we might, yeah. Thank you, Camilla. And I would just say, academic perspective, green industrial policy, good quality green industrial policy is a process of systematic learning. The collaborations that you've talked about today are an example of international green industrial policy and a process through which we can systematically learn as these industries evolve. thank you all very, very much for your time. Thank you all for staying with us right beyond the end. And I'll hand over.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to be really quick. We're over time. Thanks for your patience. But I think it was valuable to draw some questions online and also from some members of the audience. We've really gone from a very human scale discussion, households, really up to a very large multi-decadal change and how you might enable those. Clearly, there's an enormous amount continuous, and the ANU will certainly continue working in this space. Please do get in touch if you would like to work together with us as we navigate this. Thanks for today. Thanks.